When Big 30's cousin Gino was killed in Memphis, Big 30 slid. And what happened in the months that followed, the silence, the darkness, the music that came out of it, confirmed that he did, just not in the way everybody assumed. People noticed it immediately. Something shifted. The records got heavier. The delivery got darker. A man who had been moving with momentum suddenly went somewhere deep. And when he came back, nothing about him was the same. The people inside that Memphis circle understood why. And if you listen closely to what Big 30 put on record after that January 2022 night in Whitehaven, he tells you exactly what he did with the pain. In this documentary, we are going to break down everything. We are going back to where Big 30 comes from, who Gino was in his life, and how that night unfolded. We are going to talk about the depression that followed, the way he fought through it in the studio, and how the Memphis gang wars surrounding all of it shaped everything he put on record. By the end of this, you are going to understand that what Big 30 did after losing Gino was in some ways more devastating than anything the streets expected. He took that grief and turned it into music that cannot be ignored. Yo, what's good, fam? Today we are going all the way in on one of the most personal chapters in Big 30's career. This is the story of what losing Gino did to him and exactly what he did with it. Before we get into any of that, you need to understand the foundation, because Big 30 is not a rapper who invented a persona when the cameras came on. Everything he raps about is rooted in something real. And to understand the weight of what Gino's death meant, you have to understand where both of them came from. Big 30, born Rodney Lamont Wright Jr. on December 28, 1999. Grew up in Whitehaven on the south side of Memphis, Tennessee. Whitehaven carries a complicated identity inside the city's geography. Historically, it was a black working-class community where families put down roots and built something stable. But economic pressure and decades of disinvestment hardened parts of it into something much more difficult to navigate. For kids growing up there, the environment was not something you could ignore or think your way around. It got into you whether you invited it or not. The schools were underfunded. The job market was thin, and the street economy filled in the gaps the way it always does when legitimate options run dry. By the time Big 30 was coming of age in Whitehaven, the neighborhood had already absorbed generations of that pressure, and it showed in every block. Big 30 has spoken openly about his upbringing, his close bonds with his parents, and the adjustments it took to transition from the life he was living to the life that rap eventually offered him. His early friendship with Pooh Shiesty tells you exactly how deep those roots run. Shiesty recalled in interviews that he had known Big 30 since around 4th or 5th grade. Big 30 was from Whitehaven, but his cousins lived over in Cane Creek on the south side. And after getting kicked out of school, he ended up at an alternative school in South Memphis, where Shiesty was already attending. Before music, before the industry, before any of it, they clicked as young kids from the same streets. That kind of bond formed young in a hard environment does not break easily. Big 30's earliest recordings circulated locally before the broader hip-hop world had any idea who he was. He built his name through neighborhood credibility and raw talent, appearing on street records in the Chopper Gang orbit before anything formal took shape. The record Neighbors with Pooh Shiesty cracked the Billboard Hot 100 at number 51 in 2021 and introduced him nationally. His debut mixtape King of Kill Branch followed that same year with features from Lil Durk, Future, Quavo, Moneybagg Yo, Pooh Shiesty, Yo Gotti, and Offset. That roster on a debut does not happen by accident. It happens because the industry has already been watching you and made up its mind. He was signed to Moneybagg Yo's Bread Gang label, part of a tight Memphis network that included Big Homie AG, Fredo Ruthless, and others connected to the city's new power structure in rap. From the outside looking in, everything was pointed upward. But here's where it gets real. Because the most important relationship in Big 30's life during all of this had nothing to do with the label deal or feature placement. It was his cousin, Gino. Gino was not on the edges of Big 30's world. He was the center of it. Big 30 described him publicly as his cousin, his everything, someone he had known since kindergarten. Let that land for a second, fam. Since kindergarten. These were not two people who saw each other at family events and kept it moving. These were two people who came up side by side through every stage of life that matters. The same streets, the same pressures, the same early memories. When Big 30 started making moves in rap, Gino was part of that world too, connected to the same Bread Gang network. building his own lane as an artist. He had given interviews about his Whitehaven upbringing and his time navigating the juvenile system, and he credited Moneybagg Yo with pushing him toward music as a path forward. He was not watching from the sidelines. He was in the game building right alongside his cousin. Big 30 called Gino his role model. That is the exact word he used. Not just his cousin, not just his closest friend, but his role model. The person who showed him how to carry himself, how to move, what it looked like to be the kind of man you needed to be in Memphis, to survive and still be respected. That kind of influence does not fade when the person is gone. It stays with you. And when the one who carried it is taken, you feel the absence of it in every decision you make from that point forward. Now, this is where we got to address the night everything changed. January 28, 2022. That is the date that permanently divided Big 30's life into before and after. Earlier that same evening, he and Gino had performed together at a local high school in Memphis. Hold that image. Two cousins, two artists, on stage together in the community they both came from, performing for the next generation. The kind of moment that feels like proof that things are building towards something, that the work is connecting, that the future is taking shape. When the show was over, they went their separate ways. Gino returned to the Whitehaven section of Memphis, to the housing project where he and Big 30 were from. Around 7 in the evening, he was shot multiple times. Medics arrived on the scene and found him with multiple gunshot wounds. He was pronounced dead immediately. He was 26 years old. No suspects were publicly identified in the immediate aftermath.
At the New Horizon River Apartments in the 3000 block of Kazaza. Now, what we're being told is that police were dispatched here about an hour ago after getting a call about gunshots being fired in the area. Now, what we do know right now is that police are reporting that one male victim was shot here on this scene.
No official motive was confirmed by law enforcement in the public record. The investigation moved the way too many Memphis shootings move, drawing attention for a brief window before getting absorbed into the next crisis in the city, processing violence at a pace most places cannot comprehend. In 2021 alone, Memphis recorded 342 homicides, a number that included young Dolph, killed just 2 months before Gino in November of that year, while buying cookies at a local bakery.
Memphis rapper Young Dolph was shot and killed at a bakery today. Young Dolph, whose real name is Adolph Robert Thornton Jr., was reportedly buying cookies at this bakery in his hometown when someone drove up and shot him. He was expected to give out turkeys for Thanksgiving on Friday. A county commissioner called his death gut-wrenching.
The city was not catching its breath, and neither was Big 30. Moneybagg Yo went to social media immediately with tribute posts and broken heart emojis. Big Homie AG and others from the Bread Gang circle confirmed the loss publicly. The mourning spread fast through the Memphis rap community. But for Big 30, what everyone else experienced as a collective loss was something on a completely different level. This was his person, the man he had known since kindergarten, his role model, gone in a Whitehaven parking lot on the same evening they had been on stage together hours before. Big 30's tribute post did not read like a public statement. It read like a man whose foundation had caved in underneath him. He wrote that Gino was his cousin, his everything, all he had known since kindergarten, his go-to man, his role model, and that everything was gone. He said losing Gino was his worst nightmare, that he had never been crushed like this before, that he had never even known this feeling existed. He said what was killing him most was knowing he would never see him again. He spoke about promises they had made to each other and made clear that no one would ever disrespect Gino's name while he was still alive. Now here is where the story goes in a direction that surprised people. Because when Big 30 lost Gino, the streets expected a certain kind of response. That is just a reality of Memphis and the world both of them came from. When someone that close to you is taken, there is an assumption about what follows. People were watching, people were waiting, and what Big 30 did instead was something that in its own way required just as much out of him as anything the streets could have demanded. He went into a depression, and then he went into the studio. That might sound simple, but it was not. Big 30 has been open about the fact that Gino's death plunged him into a deep and lasting depression, that the grief altered his mental state in ways he had to actively fight through every single day. He stopped sleeping right. He stopped eating right. The routines that had kept him functional through the grind of building a rap career from nothing, the studio sessions, the features, the constant forward motion, All of it lost its meaning overnight. What was the point of any of it when the person he had been building alongside since childhood was gone? That question did not have an easy answer. And for a long stretch after January 2022, Big 30 was living inside it without a clear way out. He could not stay in rap mode. He said it himself later when his situation with Moneybagg Yo became public. After Gino died, he was not able to keep working like nothing had happened. He was on something different. He was carrying something that did not have a clean outlet in the normal sense. The industry does not pause for grief. Features still get requested. Labels still want product. The machine keeps moving whether you are ready or not. And Big 30 was not ready. He needed time that the business side of music does not naturally offer, and he took it anyway because he had no other choice. The depression was not just emotional. It was physical. It was the kind of weight that makes the simplest tasks feel impossible, that turns a drive to the studio into an argument you have with yourself every single morning. People who have never experienced that kind of grief sometimes underestimate what it does to a person's ability to function. It is not sadness in the ordinary sense. It is a rewiring. The things that used to give you purpose stop working the same way. The future that felt real suddenly feels like something that belongs to a different version of you, a version that existed before the loss. Big 30 was navigating all of that in an environment that does not naturally create space for that kind of processing. Memphis does not pause, the streets do not pause, and the music industry certainly does not pause. He was grieving emotion, carrying it through every day whether he was ready to or not. What he eventually found was the booth, not as a career move, but because the pain had to go somewhere, and music was the only container he trusted to hold it. He began pouring the depression and the rage and the raw, unprocessed grief directly into the records. And the music that came out of that period sounds exactly like what it is. The aggression that had always been part of his style became something more desperate, more personal, more urgent. There is a difference between a rapper performing toughness and a rapper rapping from inside actual devastation. Big 30 after January 2022 was the second thing. Every bar carried weight that had not been there before, because the weight he was carrying in real life had nowhere else to go. Let me break down for y'all what that process actually looks like from the inside. Big 30 did not grow up in an environment that offered a lot of space for visible grief. Whitehaven, Cane Creek, South Memphis, these are places where you absorb pain and keep moving, where showing too much of what you feel can be read as weakness in ways that carry real consequences. Vulnerability in that environment is a liability. You learn early to internalize loss and project strength, because the alternative can cost you. And yet the loss of Gino was so total that Big 30 could not perform normalcy around it. The grief was bigger than the cold. So he found the one place where he could be honest about it without those consequences. And he went there every day. His sophomore project, Last Man Standing, came through that period and featured records like Own My Mama, Dead Guys, and Protest. Those titles are not accidents. A man processing the death of his closest person does not accidentally name a record Dead Guys. That is an artist making the grief visible, keeping it present, refusing to tuck it into something more commercially palatable. On My Mama carries the weight of someone making a vow, the kind of promise you make to the dead when you cannot make it to them directly anymore. Protest is exactly what it sounds like. A man pushing back against the circumstances that took someone he loved. Taken together, these records form a document of where Big 30's head was at during the worst stretch of his life. And listeners felt it even when they did not have the full context behind it. Now let's talk about the environment that made all of this possible. Because the broader Memphis gang war context here is not background noise. It is the whole stage that this story plays out on. And to understand what Gino walked into that evening, you have to understand what Memphis had become by 2022 and how it got there. By 2021, law enforcement estimated over 100 active gang organizations operating in Memphis with more than 13,000 members spread across the city. Let that number sit with you for a second. 13,000 people tied to gang activity in a single American city. These were not loosely affiliated groups spread across a wide geography. These were tight, neighborhood-level crews operating in extreme proximity to one another, where a single street could mark the boundary between factions that had been at war for years. The closeness of it meant that conflicts escalated fast, that the consequences were immediate, and that the violence rarely stayed contained to the people directly involved in whatever sparked it. Whitehaven specifically was one of the neighborhoods where that tension ran deepest. Situated on the southern edge of Memphis near the Mississippi state line, Whitehaven had become a pressure point where multiple factions overlapped and competed for the same limited territory. The neighborhood had gone through decades of demographic and economic shifts that hollowed out its middle class and left behind concentrated poverty in parts that had once been stable. When economic opportunity disappears from a community and institutional support fails to fill the gap, the street economy moves in and brings its own hierarchies, its own rules, and its own enforcement mechanisms. By the time Big 30 and Gino were coming of age in Whitehaven, those structures were deeply embedded in the daily life of the neighborhood. What made Memphis gang conflicts particularly deadly during this era was the combination of hyperlocal grudges and the availability of weapons. These were not ideological conflicts or large-scale criminal enterprises in the organized crime sense. They were neighborhood-level disputes over turf, reputation, and respect that had been running for so long that many of the people involved could not fully trace how they started. But they knew exactly what side they were on and exactly what the expectations were. When someone from your side got hurt, there was a calculus that the streets applied automatically. The question was never whether something would happen next. It was when and how. That calculus is what Big 30 had been navigating his entire life. It is what his music documented from the beginning, and it is what makes the timing of Gino's death so devastating. They had just been on a high school stage performing for kids who were growing up in the same environment they had come out of. They were proof that there was another path, that the music could be the way out. And then Gino went back to the block, and the block took him anyway. No level of industry connection, no label deal, no streaming numbers, no momentum in the rap game changed what happened when he stepped back into the housing project that night. The streets did not care about any of that. Memphis had been building toward that moment for years. The murder of young Dolph in November 2021 had already sent a message through the city that nobody was untouchable, that the violence could reach anyone regardless of how visible or loved they were. Dolph had been one of the most respected independent voices in Memphis rap, a man who had survived multiple attempts on his life and turned that survival into his artistic identity. When he was finally killed, the grief that swept through Memphis was enormous and immediate. It also accelerated something in the atmosphere of the city. The sense that things were escalating, that the conflicts were becoming more brazen, that the period of restraint, if there ever had been one, was over. Gino's death came into that atmosphere just 2 months later. For Big 30, it was personal in a way that Dolph's death, as devastating as it was for the city, could not be. This was not someone he admired from across the industry. This was the man who had been his everything since kindergarten. And he died in the same housing project they had both called home, in the same city that had just buried one of its most beloved artists, inside the same ongoing conflict that Big 30 had been rapping about since before anyone outside Memphis knew his name. Real talk, this is also where the Moneybagg Yo situation becomes impossible to separate from the grief. When Big 30 went public with his frustrations in 2024, one of the sharpest points in everything he said centered on Gino's funeral. He claimed he had $150,000 in a backpack, ready to spend whatever it took to make sure Gino was put away right. He said Moneybagg called his phone asking to be allowed to pay for the funeral but never actually showed up. He said there was a fundamental difference between posting a car on social media and being physically present in that car. For Big 30, the way people responded to Gino's death, or failed to respond, became a test of who was actually who. And in his account, Moneybagg did not pass it. Big 30 later confirmed in interviews that he was no longer part of Bread Gang and had been bought out of his contract. He pushed back against the framing that he was in direct beef with Moneybagg, but made clear that things between them were not what they had been. Every fan who had been following the timeline ran it straight back to Gino because the loss sat right in the middle of everything. The grief, the withdrawal, the sense that people had not shown up, the eventual falling out, all of it connected for anyone who had been paying attention from the beginning. When Big 30 dropped Still King in May 2024, it arrived after a significant absence. The album was a testament to his resilience after time spent mourning. He came back with renewed energy and a Memphis sound that had not softened in his time away, but had gone deeper. Still King was deliberately stripped back compared to King of Kill Branch, with Big 30 carrying the weight of most of the project himself rather than leaning on a guest-heavy approach. That choice was not accidental. It was a statement that he did not need to surround himself with names to prove he belonged. he was enough. He had survived enough. And the album was the proof. The most revealing moment on the project came on Being a Threat, where he rapped about losing his cousin and being mentally destroyed, saying he could not put it into words beyond just saying, man, before invoking his mother's wisdom about pain being the price of growth. That is not a throwaway bar. That is 2 years of depression and survival and grief compressed into a single line. It is the kind of lyric that only gets written by someone who has actually been through something and come out the other side still standing, but permanently changed by what it cost them to get there. Still King was his third album, and each project in the sequence carries a different emotional register. King of Killbranch announced him. Last Man Standing proved he could sustain under pressure. Still King asserted that whatever Memphis had taken from him, whatever the industry had done, whatever grief had tried to hollow out, he was still standing. The title was not just a commercial statement. It was something he was saying to himself as much as to anyone listening. Big 30 is not alone in navigating this terrain. Memphis has a long tradition of artists converting tragedy into music that becomes both personal testimony and cultural record. Key Glock channeled his grief over losing Young Dolph into Glaucoma 2, one of the most emotionally raw projects in modern Memphis rap. Young Dolph himself built his entire artistic identity around surviving what the city could throw at you. And his death in November 2021 proved that no level of fame puts a person completely outside its reach. Glorilla, Moneybagg Yo, and others from the city's current generation have all spoken at various points about loss and about how violence does not stop because your name is on a streaming platform. Fame changes your resources. It does not always change your proximity to danger, and it does not protect the people still living in the neighborhood where you started. That is the part of this story that needs to stay with you. Gino was also in the industry. He was signed. He was building. He and Big 30 were not in two separate worlds where one made it out and one did not. They were running the same race alongside each other, cousins in the same lane, both trying to turn survival into something lasting. And Gino still could not outrun what Memphis had waiting for him on the evening of January 28, 2022. At the end of the day, this is not a story about industry politics or label fallout, or even about one night of violence in Whitehaven. It is a story about what it costs to come from where these two men came from, and what you are left holding when the person who shaped you is suddenly gone. Big 30 did not handle that loss from a distance or in silence. He fell into the depression, fought through it with the only tool that did not let him down, and eventually came back and put all of it on record in ways that are still being felt in his music today. Every heavy bar he has rapped since January 2022, every reference to loyalty and loss, every record that carries that specific darkness you cannot fake, that is Gino still present in the work. That is a man honoring the promise he made when he said he would never let his cousin's name be disrespected while he was still on this earth. Memphis made both of them. Memphis took one of them. And the one still here has spent every year since making sure that is not where the story ends. Drop your thoughts in the comments, fam, and check out the video on screen for more.